Hello casters, and welcome to this beginner's guide to the Frost element in Elestrals. Today I'm going to be breaking down all of the runes Frost has access to, as well as the best Elestrals you can be playing. I'm also going to touch on the pros and cons of playing Frost currently in the metagame, and discuss the current best builds. There's a guide just like this for every element in Elestrals on the channel, so if you find this video helpful, make sure you check out the others, but for now, let's forage in Frost. Starting off with the Divine Rune then, we have Kione. When you cast this, you can enchant up to 3 Frost to it, and you can disenchant 1 Frost from this Kione in order to return a 1-spirit Frost Elestral from your underworld to your hand. This is certainly a really good value option and can allow you to spam certain Elestrals that cause headaches for the opponent, either by their stat line or by the effect of a certain card. But the main issue of Kione is it's a terrible early game draw, and you're already going to maximize copies of your best Elestrals in the deck regardless. So it does feel like a fairly difficult to justify inclusion in most Frost builds. You'll notice in Frost there are a few cards that have self-mill effects, and that can actually speed up the activation of your Kione. So there is somewhat of an undercurrent in Frost for this effect to be utilised earlier on in the game, but at the moment it's not the most inspiring Divine Rune we have access to, especially because all that value you're trying to accrue can be capitalised by an opponent by simply having rune removal. And if you go cautious on the Kione, it's only really going to be like a +1 or 2 cards over a number of turns as well. For the artifacts, we have the Scepter of Kione. For 2 Frost, the Empowered Elestral gets +2 attack and +1 defense. And when Kione is enchanted and the Empowered Elestral destroys an Elestral in battle, you can special cast a 1-spirit Frost Elestral from your hand. So the buff itself isn't all that impressive, and Frost already has fairly low statted Elestrals in general, but as we know, this walks into a number of awkward back row. And that special cast isn't actually a big deal in Frost, when oftentimes the Ascensions are going to be the selling points of this archetype. And again, because the raw stats on many Frost Elestrals aren't that powerful, trying to swarm these Elestrals into play isn't that effective because your opponent can simply clear them by attacking back into the following turn. Onto the stadiums, we have the Mountains of Boreas. This is our buff stadium rune for Frost, where it gets +1 attack and defense for each Frost enchanting them, just like in every other element. But then we also have the Ursa Den, which gives Ursa Elestrals +1 attack and defense, and when a player casts an Ursa Elestral, you can enchant 1 spirit to this Ursa Den, then you can disenchant 4 from the Ursa Den in order to special cast an Ursa from your hand or deck. Honestly, just a terrible stadium rune. Even the Ursa archetypes don't look towards including this card, but it exists nonetheless. Onto the Invoke runes then, we start with Blizzard. For 2 Frost, this can't be chained by counter runes, and you can target and destroy an opponent's face-down rune. This is like a really expensive Thunderstorm, and you can't even deal with face-ups, so it's quite limited in its utility. Next up there's Avalanche. It's a 1 Frost Invoke rune, and each player sends the top 3 cards from their deck to their underworld, and then if you control a Frost Enchanted Elestral, you can send an additional 2 cards from your deck to your underworld. Yeah, this card is just terrible. Minusing 1 from hand, just to try and activate the likes of Kione, or some special casting Elestrals, just isn't really worth the payoff, when there are already a number of Elestrals which can provide some guaranteed discard, but we'll look at later. And then we end on Cryoblast. This is definitely the best of the bunch. For 1 Frost Spirit, you can target an Elestral that is not Frost Enchanted. Until the end phase, you give it -2 defense, and when that Elestral has 0 defense, you must destroy it. There are a huge number of high attack stat, low defense stat Elestrals that get immediately punished by this Cryoblast. And there could even be those situations where you can walk over some 5 and 6 defense Elestrals as well, with the help of this stat reduction. Cryoblast is so powerful, especially with the limit to Earthquake, that this finds its way into all sorts of decks, and a small number of Frost Spirits enter their list. And at the very least, into certain matchups, this is a phenomenal sideboard option. Onto the Nexus and Receive options for Frost then, we start with Brumalinx. This is a 3/5 body that can Nexus up to 2 Frost, and when you do, you can target a non-stadium rune. If it's face up, you turn it face down, and that rune cannot be cast as long as this Brumalinx is enchanted. This is a cool way to remove some spirits from Divine Runes that are in play, and if the opponent has set a face down, you can deny that cast. And the natural stats on Brumalinx aren't too terrible either. This is a decent card that can just sit in play and enable other Nexus options. The main issue, as I mentioned, is that Kione is not a great sort of Nexus user, so Frost is still kind of lacking these options. Brumalinx definitely feels like one of those sort of lying in wait cards for when we get a few more decent receivers in Frost. Frigid Cub's a pretty powerful one. It's a 4/2 body that can also Nexus up to 2 Frost, and when you do, you can enchant 1 Frost from your underworld to this Frigid Cub. So it's almost some pseudo-healing. You can pull these spirits off to play certain runes, or it could be a way to pressurize with your Frigid Cub. This obviously has great synergy with the Mountains of Boreas, where your Frigid Cub gets a big stat buff and is then pushing damage at the same time. But that is reliant on a bit of a combo. You've got to have a stadium in play and extra floating spirits that make this card work. and unfortunately its base stats aren't strong enough to hold its own. Catarant is the healer that Frost has access to. It's a 3/1 body, and when it receives a Frost, you can return up to 2 Frost from your Underworld to your Spirit deck. Frost is definitely one of the more Spirit-hungry archetypes in the game, so Catarant is very often going to be a 1 or 2 of inclusion in your Frost lists to make sure you top up on spirits. Onto the other staples then, we start off with Morolith, which is a 6/4 body for 2 Frost. That can be normal cast if an opponent has fewer Elestrals in their Underworld than you do. And when you cast this Morolith, you must send the top 5 cards from your deck to your Underworld. This is a very decent body that is very easy to get into play, especially when I mention some of the more Frost in a moment, making it an absolute build around in Frost. In fact, you often want to play 3 copies of this card because as soon as you successfully cast 1 Morolith, your remaining Morolith will have no problem getting into play after that 5-card discard. And once again, there's the same synergy with Kione, where you've self-milled and now you can almost use your discard pile as a second hand alongside your Divine Rune. Then we have the couple of Frost Ursas. There's Ursicle, which is a 1/3, and when normal cast, you can search your deck for an Ursa Elestral or Rune and add it to your hand. I actually think the strongest use of this Ursicle is to grab Don't Poke the Bear, which is kind of the linchpin rune that Ursa has access to. And normally you combine this with some of the Fire Ursas to get some additional special casts in. So the Ursicle adds to just the consistency of the deck. Whereas the Abomin Ursa is a 3/1 Frost Spirit Elestral that gains +2 attack for each other Ursa Elestral on your field. This becomes a very dangerous and powerful threat once you get some of those Fire Elestrals getting special casts off for you to allow that sort of swarm approach. So it's kind of a slow card, but a big payoff once you get your special casts rolling. And then we have this More Frost package. First of all, there's the Lycan form, which has a 2/3 body, but you can expend 1 Frost and discard this More Frost in order to search your deck for up to 2 More Frost that are not Lycan form and add them to your hand. This has obvious and incredible synergy with Morolith, because this is just going to discard itself straight away. You're +1ing from hand, whilst also activating your Morolith, so your 6/4 can be normal cast immediately. Lycan form is also kind of the card that adds consistency to a more Frost focused deck, but you could very easily just see 3 copies of Lycan, then a handful of other More Frost going into a Morolith based deck. The Indus form is just a 2/1, and when you cast this, you can expend a Frost in order to search your deck for up to 2 More Frost and send them to your Underworld. When this More Frost is destroyed in battle, you can target and destroy a face down rune. So once again, a little bit less helpful than the Lycan because you're essentially sacrificing your normal cast for a very small body and you're also having to expend, but it's just another way that you could fuel your discard to weave in that Morolith, or to buff the Abominable form, which we'll look at in a moment. And then there'll be times where you attempt to crash this into higher statted Elestrals on the opponent's field in order to pop a rune. It's normally not advisable to sacrifice your normal cast to make that happen. Then we have the Bat form. This is just a 1/1, but when this Morfrost is discarded, you can special cast a Morfrost that is not the Bat form from your Underworld. So the Terraform can, in theory, discard bats for you, and if you already have other Morfrost in your discard pile, you can get some special casts in. The Abominable form is meant to be the sort of beat stick of this approach, where it's just a 1/3, but gains +1 attack for each Morfrost in your Underworld, and you can disenchant 1 Frost from this in order to special cast a Morfrost that is not Abominable from your Underworld. Typically, you won't be looking to do the special cast roulette, because this Morfrost is often looking to be the biggest card that you have access to in Morfrost. But it normally takes some setting up with your Lycan, and likely the Indus form as well, or failing that, just having some favourable Morolith discards. And then finally there's the Terraform. It's just a 2/3, but your opponent's Elestrals do get -1 attack for each Frost enchanting this, and when a player activates a card effect that targets 1 or more of your Morfrost, you can discard a Morfrost in order to negate that effect and destroy that card. If you're leaning very heavily into this Morfrost package, the dream of course is that you can use the Lycan form to tutor out the likes of Terra and Bat, and find an opportunity to weave in the Terraform when you already have Abominable developed, allowing that Abominable to get more attacks in, and then punish the opponent for trying to target it with certain card effects. And in the dream situation, you're getting rid of a bat and getting additional special casts on top of that. It's a bit of a dreamer play, but with so much tutor in the Morfrost package, it sometimes can come up, and its naturally small body is offset a little bit at least with the -1 attack threat that it does provide. At the moment, we can play a total of 15 copies of Morfrost in our deck, so there are plenty of ways to push the Abominable into a very high damage option. But I think for the most part, we're seeing thin packages of Morfrost in lists to activate the faster attackers like Morolith, and have this as a late game swing card in very low counts. Onto the Ascensions then, and Frost has a few really great ones to pick from. We'll start off with Rhynymph, which is just a 1/5, but you can expend a Frost in order to move this Rhynymph to your rune row, and then it becomes an artifact empowering an Elestral of your choice with the effect the empowered Elestral is suppressed and gets -2 defense. So setting this Rhinymph in defense is fantastic because it has that natural 5 bulk, and expending to push it to the rune row is exactly how we special ascend into Rhinosect, which is a crazy 8/5 body for 2 Frost that can be special cast if you have a card that is originally an Elestral in your rune row, and that's what Rhinymph does. And then you can target and destroy an empowered Elestral. Rhinymph is also going to be targeting your opponent's things, of course. So you are losing out on a few spirits, but you're targeting and destroying an Elestral, coming out onto the board with a huge body, and either swinging over additional threats, or sort of leveling up the spirit investment you've used with your Rhinymph, and sitting on the board with a really impressive 8/5 body. Then we have Cryoling, which is a 1/3 but gains +1 attack for each Frost in your Underworld. When this Cryoling has 6 or more attack during your main phase, you must either destroy it or special ascend it to Cryovern from your hand or deck. Cryovern is a 7/4 body, and during your draw phase, you can discard your hand in order to special ascend this Cryovern to Cryoscorch from your deck. It's actually not uncommon to misenchant the Cryovern once you get the special ascension off from Cryoling, typically alongside water, so that you don't walk into Tsunami and you just forego Cryoscorch altogether, because cheating out a 7/4 is a pretty decent payoff. But you can also lean into the huge Cryoscorch, which is 2 Frost and 1 Fire Spirit. And when you special ascend this Cryoscorch, you must destroy all runes, and you can expend your spirit deck, which has to be at least 1, to force your opponent to expend 5 spirits. This adds some OTK element to some Frost decks, because expending 5, then getting a swing in with this ridiculous Cryoscorch after you've removed back row from the opponent, is typically going to finish them off if you're in a mid-game situation. So it really doesn't matter the fact that you're expending your entire spirit deck, because the Cryoscorch is essentially shaking your opponent's hand. Onto the main archetypes that Frost has access to, and we'll start off with the Morolith Morfrost deck. This really is just saying that 6 is a great number, and Morolith has that, and can be brought into play very quickly, especially when you have the Lichen form helping out here, which discards itself and also thins the deck for you quite naturally. Like I said, as soon as you get that Morolith online, your future Moroliths should have no problem coming into play thanks to your discard, and this is simply a very effective beater. Then we have Rhinoscorch. There's decent synergy here. Using the likes of Nectar of the Gods allows you to accumulate your Rhinosect combination a little bit quicker, but also gets Frost Spirits in your discard pile quickly to allow your Cryoling to immediately ascend into that Cryovern to be another solid attacking presence. Whenever you are able to amass those Rhinosect, they can have crazy special cast options, and I should mention that you can have multiple Rhinosect in hand, special casting at the same time from one Rhinymph activation. So unlike the majority of other Ascensions, which find it more difficult to come into play if you draw into multiple of them and you're actually pulling your hair out, this archetype specifically loves drawing multiple Rhinosect. In fact, it could be devastating for the opponent. This is definitely a really cool one. If you like just playing big stats, this is a great deck to pick up and play. Actually one of my favourites right now. Onto the pros and cons of Frost then. There is no shortage of beat sticks here. You have Morolith, which is a crazy strong normal cast, and you have some of the easiest Ascension lines available to you. Your 1-Spirit Frost guys, they're not that big, but we just have to go for the other cheat codes in order to overcome plenty of lower to the ground strategies. But when we do, we have some very impressive stat lines. Another pro is that we have Narpoon, which is a 1-Spirit Water Elestral, which searches for a 1-Spirit Frost Elestral. This gives you more consistency in your deck, but also allows that sort of splash of water, which, as we know, is fantastic, because water has some other great cards like Eddy and Galaxy, and those big bodies sort of help out the fact that you naturally don't have many big bodies in Frost. So trying to hybrid between the two is fantastic, and then because you're playing a solid split of spirits, you get to play both Cryoblast, which is a crazy invoke rune, and Tsunami in your deck, which is a crazy counter rune, really ramping up the power level of your archetype just by having great native runes you can play. The main issues of Frost right now then is that most of the strategies are quite combo based, so you do have to be comfortable playing from behind whilst you accumulate these pieces. And you're going to have those bad beats where things just don't come together and you have those awkward draws. Or if you don't win off your initial combo and that pressure that you can represent, your sort of second wave of pressure never really comes together because you've spent so many spirits in that first burst. And the other main con right now is that Kione generates value rather than tempo, making it pretty difficult to justify Nexus, even though there are some pretty decent receivers in Frost. Oftentimes, if you're actually trying to build something with Frost Nexus, it might even be Argo that's just the better option here. Using the likes of Necklace of Harmonia alongside Frigicub could be pretty cool. And moving spirits between Frigicub and Catarant is a great way to actually get a lot of healing in. So that's something I want to explore a little bit more. But until that time, we need to have more discarding cards to allow that Kione to be a really good early game card, because right now, there just aren't many times where you're happy to draw Kione. It's only really on like turn 4 or 5 when she feels fantastic, and then either before or after she feels pretty rough. Follow the link in the description down below to check out my most recent deck lists. You can see there's already Morphrost there. There's already Rhino Scorch, which I personally enjoy playing a lot. Also, by following that link, you can see for all the elements, the sort of best Elestrals you can be playing, and all of the runes that are currently in the game. Once again, if you're interested in the other elements, check out the channel for all those other videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again for another one soon. Cheers.